Before we dive into today's story, tell us, what country are you watching from and what time is it right now? Drop your answer in the comments and don't forget to hit that subscribe button if stories about justice, racism, and courage speak to you. Now, imagine this. A black man is standing beside his car in a busy supermarket parking lot on a sunny Saturday. Suddenly, a white woman storms out of her SUV and slaps him across the face, hard, before accusing him of assaulting her. People are watching. Some start filming. And in that moment, everything shifts. You won't believe how this story unfolds. His name is David Carter, a quiet, level-headed man in his late 30s who had simply come to grab groceries before dinner. As he pulled into the parking lot of a suburban grocery store, he spotted a prime parking spot near the entrance. Without thinking much of it, he eased his sedan into the space, double-checked his alignment, turned off the engine, and cracked the door open to step outside. That's when he heard it, the sharp screech of tires and the unmistakable rumble of entitlement. A white SUV swerved into the spot next to him with a jolt, its driver visibly furious. Through the half-rolled window, a woman with stiff platinum blonde hair and a tight jawline jabbed a finger in his direction. "That was my spot!" she screamed. David blinked, surprised by the venom in her voice. "Excuse me?" he asked, calm but clearly confused. She flung her door open with force and marched toward him, fists clenched, voice rising like a siren. "I had my blinker on. I was waiting for it. You people always pull this crap." David glanced around, scanning the lane. There had been no car when he pulled in, no signal, nothing. Still, he kept his voice even. "I didn't see anyone waiting. The spot looked open." That only enraged her further. She stepped into his personal space, eyes wide, nostrils flaring. "Of course you didn't see me. You people never do." That phrase, "you people," hit him like a gut punch. He knew exactly where this was headed. He'd seen it before. Minor inconvenience morphing into a racially charged altercation, one insult at a time, but he wouldn't give her the satisfaction. "Ma'am," he said slowly, trying to de-escalate, "I'm just here to buy some groceries. I don't want any trouble." Her face twisted like a storm cloud. "Trouble? You're the trouble, coming into neighborhoods like this thinking you can take what you want. I bet you don't even live around here." The implication was clear. David's fists clenched at his sides. He took a deep breath. "Not today," he told himself. "Where I live has nothing to do with a parking spot," he replied. But she wasn't finished. "Yes, it does," she barked. "This is what happens when they let people like you in, entitled, disrespectful, thinking the rules don't apply." Her voice rose with every word. A few passers-by had begun to pause, sensing the energy shift. David noticed, too. This wasn't just a rant anymore. It was turning into a spectacle. "It's just a parking space," he said, stepping away. "It's not worth this." But before he could take more than 2 steps toward the store, she shoved him hard from behind. David stumbled forward, catching himself on the hood of his car. His heart pounded. He turned back slowly, eyes wide. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he snapped, heat rising behind his words. "You don't get to put your hands on me." But she didn't back down. She stood there, trembling with fury. "I'll do whatever I damn well please," she hissed. "Don't walk away from me, boy." That word, boy, hung in the air like a slap all on its own. David froze. His palms tightened into fists. His mind spun with all the possible outcomes. He knew exactly how this could be framed. A black man standing his ground could easily be twisted into a threat. His voice was quiet but firm now. "Lady, walk away. Before you do something you'll regret." She narrowed her eyes, then, without warning, swung her hand through the air and slapped him. Hard. The sound cracked through the parking lot like a gunshot. David's head jerked to the side, the sting spreading across his cheek and jaw. And just like that, time froze. People nearby gasped. A phone camera clicked on. David's ears rang. His dignity burned hotter than his skin. He stared at her, stunned, trying to process what just happened. She had slapped him. unprovoked, and now stood there, chest puffed out, waiting to see what he would do. Something inside him snapped. Without shouting, without rage, he raised his hand and slapped her back. Not with force, not out of fury, but with calm, controlled intent. Just enough to say, "You can't do this to people." She stumbled, hand flying to her cheek, and then she screamed, "You hit me! You animal! I'll ruin you!" The parking lot exploded in chaos. Phones out, whispers rising, and David, still frozen by the car, knew the world had just shifted on its axis. But this was just the beginning. David stood frozen as Deborah's screams pierced the air, her voice shrill and panicked, calculated to sound like the wails of a wounded victim. "He hit me! You saw that! He just hit a woman in broad daylight!" She spun around, looking for supporters among the onlookers now gathering, most of them too stunned to speak. Some started whispering, others raised their phones, recording the aftermath without knowing the full context. David's heart pounded in his chest, not just from the adrenaline of the confrontation, but from the sinking awareness that the narrative was already slipping from his hands. He'd been here before, not in this exact way, but in moments that smelled the same. He could see it in the cautious, questioning glances. A black man with his hand raised, a white woman crying assault. The outcome in stories like this rarely favored someone like him. He took a few slow steps back, raising his hand slightly in a gesture of peace, voice low but steady. "You hit me first. I didn't want any trouble. I just wanted to buy some groceries." Deborah clutched her cheek dramatically, as though his measured response had knocked her into another dimension. "I don't care what you wanted," she barked. "You'll pay for this. You think you can lay hands on me and walk away? You're done. Do you know who I am?" Her voice had turned into a theatrical performance, sharp and overacted. It was no longer just anger. It was strategy. David glanced around and noticed more people standing at a distance, watching with confused or sympathetic eyes, none of them stepping in. One man even started walking toward them, then thought better of it and backed away. David had seen it too many times, how people watched but didn't act, afraid of getting involved or unsure who to believe. He turned, tried to walk away again, but her voice chased him. "Yeah, run away like you people always do." The weight of her words settled heavily on him, but he didn't look back. He pushed through the sliding doors of the grocery store. The sudden drop in temperature inside a jarring contrast to the heat still burning through his chest. The sounds of shoppers, background music, and beeping registers surrounded him like static. He gripped a shopping cart, but his hand shook as he pushed it forward, his mind still in the parking lot. Every insult Deborah hurled, every stare from the crowd, it replayed on a loop. He tried to focus. Bread, milk, eggs, just get the basics and go home. But it was no use. He walked down one aisle and then another, picking up a few items out of habit, barely registering what he was doing. His jaw still ached slightly from her slap. But worse was the sting of humiliation, of knowing that in the eyes of at least a few witnesses, he might already be the villain. As he grabbed a carton of milk and tossed it into the cart with more force than necessary, he wondered. If the roles had been reversed, if he had approached her car, shouted at her, slapped her, would anyone have stopped to ask what led to it? Or would they have called the police before his hand even lowered? He sighed and headed to checkout, but his mind refused to let go. Deborah's face flashed in his memory, smug, spiteful, confident that she'd get away with it. The cashier gave him a polite smile and rang up his items, oblivious to the chaos he'd just come from. He nodded in return, paid quickly, and exited the store, his stomach tightening as he approached the parking lot. From a distance, something looked wrong. His footsteps quickened. As he neared his car, his worst suspicion was confirmed. Long, deep scratches ran across the passenger side of his vehicle, jagged, raw lines that had stripped the paint clean off in places. His breath caught, his fists clenched. It wasn't random. It wasn't kids. It was her, Deborah. She had done this, probably while he was inside buying eggs and pretending everything was normal. He ran a hand along the fresh grooves, his fingers trembling. The calm he had clung to was slipping fast. Just then, he heard a burst of laughter echo across the lot. He turned his head, and there she was. Leaning against her white SUV a few cars away, arms crossed, eyes locked on him, grinning like she'd just won a bet. "Oops," she called out mockingly. "Looks like someone keyed your car. Shame." He stared at her, fury rising like a tide. She smirked and added, "Guess next time you'll think twice before taking my spot." Her audacity was unreal. This wasn't about parking anymore. It never had been. This was about control, about dominance, about making sure he knew his place. "You think this is funny?" David called out, voice low but vibrating with anger. Deborah laughed louder. "Oh, I think it's hilarious. What are you going to do, call the cops?" "Good luck with that." They always believed me. The implication hit hard. She wasn't just bold. She was strategic. She knew the system, knew how to weaponize it, and David realized in that moment, if he didn't act, she'd keep doing this to someone else. Maybe worse. He took a slow breath, reached into his pocket, and pulled out his phone. It was time to stop pretending he could walk this one off. It was time to fight back. David's hand trembled slightly as he tapped the screen, dialing 911. His eyes never left Deborah, who was now leaning casually against her SUV like she had all the time in the world, exuding the smugness of someone who thought she was untouchable. The phone rang once, then twice, and when the dispatcher answered, David kept his voice steady despite the fire simmering just beneath the surface. "I'd like to report an incident," he said, glancing at the scratches carved into the side of his car. "A woman just vandalized my vehicle. She also slapped me earlier, and now she's laughing about it." The dispatcher asked for details, and David provided everything. Her vehicle, a white SUV with partial license plate information, the parking lot location, and a brief description of Deborah. As he spoke, Deborah began climbing back into her car. For a moment he thought she might drive off, but then she did something that made his stomach twist with disbelief. With a loud rev of her engine, she slammed the SUV into reverse and backed directly into the front bumper of his sedan. The crunch of metal against metal echoed across the lot, turning heads instantly. David's jaw dropped. He rushed forward but stopped short as her vehicle lurched forward again, then sped off, tires screeching as she disappeared around the corner. "She just hit my car and took off," David told the dispatcher urgently. "I'm following her at a safe distance." The dispatcher told him to remain on the line and not to engage. David got into his damaged vehicle, the front grille partially caved in from the impact, and pulled out of the lot, trailing her through the winding suburban streets. His heart pounded as he stayed back, watching her SUV weave through traffic. The thought repeated in his head like a warning. She really thought she could get away with it. But not this time, not today. Minutes later, red and blue lights flashed ahead. A police cruiser had intercepted her at a red light. Relief washed over David as he watched Deborah's vehicle slow and pull over. He parked a short distance behind them and remained in his car, exhaling deeply to calm himself. The adrenaline, the humiliation, the anger, it all pulsed through his veins like electricity. 2 officers exited the cruiser and approached Deborah's window. From his vantage point, David could see her gesturing wildly, shouting something incoherent. She looked frantic, playing up her performance with flailing arms and a quivering voice. It was déjà vu. She was trying to twist the story before he even had the chance to speak. David stepped out of his car and approached slowly. One of the officers, tall, firm, and composed, turned to him. "Sir, can you tell us what happened here?" It was Sergeant Logan Price, his badge catching the light as he studied David with a neutral expression. David nodded, gathering his composure. "I was in a grocery store parking lot," he began. "That woman, Deborah Whitmore, started yelling at me over a parking space. She slapped me, vandalized my car while I was inside, and then intentionally backed into it before fleeing the scene." Behind him, Deborah's voice rang out again, higher pitched this time, laced with panic. "He's lying. He attacked me. He's dangerous. I was just trying to defend myself." Sergeant Price turned back to her and raised a hand. "Ma'am, please remain calm and step out of the vehicle." Deborah's face twisted in disbelief. "Are you serious? Look at me. I'm the one who was attacked." But the sergeant's tone didn't waver. "Ma'am, step out of the vehicle." Her jaw clenched, her glare shooting daggers at David as if this entire situation had somehow been orchestrated to ruin her life. She swung her door open with exaggerated fury and climbed out, still yelling. "This is insane! You people always take their side." David bit the inside of his cheek, choosing silence over reaction. He'd seen this tactic before: provoke, escalate, then claim victimhood when the consequences land. Sergeant Price gestured for another officer to guide her to the side while he turned to inspect David's car. He ran his fingers along the long scratches and bent bumper, then nodded. "We'll need your statement," he said, "and we'll also be reviewing store surveillance footage." Deborah, overhearing, exploded again. "You can't be serious. I'm a victim here. That man slapped me." But before she could spiral further, something inside her snapped. With a sudden screech, she lunged forward and swung at David, her fists flying wildly. The officer beside her caught her arm just in time, but not before her knuckles grazed David's shoulder. "You think you can ruin me?" she shrieked. "I'll ruin you. You're nothing." Her face was twisted, not just with rage, but something deeper, something feral. It took both officers to restrain her as she kicked and flailed, screaming about being the real victim, about how this would never stand. David stood frozen, pulse racing, his eyes locked on the woman who had now physically attacked him twice, once in public and now in front of the police. Deborah's final scream echoed down the street as she was placed in handcuffs and shoved into the back of the squad car. "You're done, David Carter. You'll see." But for the first time all day, David didn't feel afraid. He felt resolute. The game she was playing, it was over, and justice was finally catching up. The next morning, this air was still, but David Carter's mind raced. The events of the previous day looped relentlessly in his head. Deborah's slap, the vandalism, her SUV smashing into his car, and her violent outburst in front of police. It should have felt like resolution. She had been arrested, handcuffed, exposed for what she was. But David didn't feel victorious. He felt unfinished. Something inside him told him this wasn't the end. He had come this far, endured the shame, the stares, the public unraveling of his dignity. Now he had to see it through. So he stood in front of the police station, took a deep breath, and stepped inside. The lobby was quiet, clean, with fluorescent lights humming softly overhead. A young officer at the front desk looked up from her computer and offered a polite, professional greeting. "Good morning. Can I help you?" David approached, his voice firm but respectful. "Yes. I was involved in an incident yesterday. I gave a statement, but I'm here to press formal charges. Assault, vandalism, property damage. I want to move forward." The officer nodded and handed him a clipboard. "Fill this out, please. Someone will be with you shortly." As David filled in the form, the pen shook slightly in his grip. Every word he wrote felt heavier than the last. Not just ink on paper, but a declaration that he refused to stay silent. He wasn't just pressing charges against a woman. He was pressing back against a system that often told men like him to stay quiet, to take it, to not make things worse. 20 minutes later, he heard his name. "Mr. Carter?" He looked up to see a familiar face approaching, Sergeant Logan Price. His voice was calm, steady as always. "Come with me. Let's get your statement finalized." David followed him through a corridor and into a small, windowless office. Inside, Sergeant Price sat behind a desk, fingers already typing on a nearby keyboard. "So, you've decided to move forward with charges against Ms. Whitmore?" he asked. David nodded, his voice unwavering. "Yes, I want her held accountable." Sergeant Price gave a brief nod of approval. "I think that's the right decision. With the witness reports, visible damage to your vehicle, and her assault in front of 2 officers, we have a strong case. And store surveillance footage is being pulled now." The affirmation helped. It wasn't just about belief, it was about evidence. Still, the ache in David's chest remained. He'd fought so hard to maintain composure, to do everything by the book, but Deborah had crossed line after line, and she'd done it with confidence, because she believed the system would protect her. Not this time. They continued for half an hour, reviewing and detailing every point in the report. Just as they were finishing up, the silence of the hallway shattered. "You can't do this to me!" a voice shrieked, furious and unmistakable. David's stomach turned cold. It was her, Deborah Whitmore. Sergeant Price's eyes flicked to the door. "She's here for her arraignment," he muttered. "Didn't expect her to arrive this early." Before he could rise, the door to the office burst open. Deborah, flanked by another officer, lunged into the room, eyes blazing with hatred. "You!" she screeched, pointing at David like he was the cause of every injustice in her life. "You're trying to destroy me. You think you can smear my name and walk away? This is all your fault." The officer holding her tried to pull her back, but she writhed violently, her eyes glassy with manic rage. "I'll sue you! You think I'm going down for this? You haven't won. You'll never win." Her voice cracked into a howl as she fought against the officer's grip. David stood slowly, his pulse hammering in his ears, but he didn't flinch. He didn't speak. He just stared at her. This woman who had humiliated him, lied about him, attacked him, now exposed in full meltdown, completely undone. The other officer finally wrestled her back into the hallway, her screams echoing down the corridor like a haunting refrain. As the door slammed shut behind her, Sergeant Price exhaled, his expression half exasperated, half knowing. "She's adding charges to her record by the minute," he said dryly. David sat back down, trying to steady his breathing. Even in custody, even after being caught red-handed, she still believed herself the victim. "You're doing the right thing," Sergeant Price continued. "We'll submit this to the district attorney. Given everything that's happened, I doubt they'll hesitate to prosecute." David nodded, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Not on the paperwork, not even on Deborah, but on the long, silent weight of being a black man who had to prove he didn't deserve what happened to him. "I'm not doing this just for me," he finally said. "I'm doing this because if someone like her doesn't face consequences, she'll keep going. She'll hurt someone else. Maybe next time it won't just be scratches or a slap." Sergeant Price met his eyes and nodded, his voice low. "Then let's make sure it doesn't get that far." And in that small, fluorescent-lit office, David Carter made a quiet vow, not just to seek justice, but to stand in it. Weeks passed and the day of the trial finally arrived. David Carter sat quietly in the courtroom, dressed in a navy blue suit, his posture upright but his nerves humming with tension. The room was bright but carried a heavy stillness, punctuated by the soft shuffle of feet and the low murmur of voices. Across the aisle sat Deborah Whitmore, her once smug demeanor now masked behind forced poise. She wore a cream-colored blazer and a tight-lipped expression, but her eyes, sharp and unyielding, still burned with entitlement. She hadn't spoken to David since the police station, but the memory of her screaming, lunging, and threatening him had never left his mind. Now, under the cold lights of the courtroom, justice would have its turn to speak. Judge Simmons, a stern, no-nonsense woman known for her impartiality, took her seat. "Be seated," she said curtly, and the room settled. The prosecution began with opening statements led by Rachel Monroe, the sharp and composed assistant district attorney. She walked the jury through the events with clarity and calm resolve, painting a clear timeline of Deborah's actions, her aggression, the racial slurs, the physical assault, the property damage, and finally, the second attack in front of officers. "Mr. Carter," she said, "was not just a victim of physical violence but of a weaponized stereotype, Ms. Whitmore used her race, her gender, and her perceived social status to attempt to dominate, discredit, and ultimately destroy a man who had done nothing but park his car and stand his ground." The words rang in David's chest like thunder. On the defense's side, Deborah's attorney, a seasoned, soft-spoken man in his 60s, stood and tried to shift the narrative. "Ms. Whitmore regrets her actions," he said, But let us not ignore that this was a confrontation that spiraled. Both parties acted emotionally. Ms. Whitmore reacted poorly, but she was frightened and overwhelmed. David stared ahead, unmoved. He had heard this line before. When white people attacked and lost control, they weren't violent. They were emotional. When black people simply stood their ground, they were aggressive. The pattern was familiar, exhausting, and insultingly transparent. The first witnesses were called, bystanders from the grocery store parking lot. One woman testified seeing the argument begin. Another recalled hearing Deborah yell, "You people always think you can take what you want." A third, a teenage boy, confirmed he heard the slap that Deborah delivered, followed by David's restrained response. "It didn't look like he wanted to fight," the teen said. "It looked like he was trying to stop it." Then it was Deborah's turn to testify. She took the stand slowly, sitting upright with hands folded neatly in her lap. "I was having a terrible day," she began, her voice soft, almost meek. "I saw the spot and assumed I could pull in. When he took it, I just lost it. I shouldn't have, but I did. I was wrong to shout and I was wrong to slap him, but he hit me back. That part can't be ignored." Rachel Monroe rose like a blade. "Ms. Whitmore," she said, walking toward the witness stand with quiet intensity, "did Mr. Carter hit you before you slapped him?" Deborah hesitated. "No." "Did he threaten you before you scratched his car or backed your SUV into his vehicle?" Again, Deborah paused, then shook her head. "No." "And did Mr. Carter attack you in front of the officers after you lunged at him and struck him a second time?" "No," she admitted, her voice faltering. "He didn't." Rachel nodded slowly, letting the silence speak for itself. "So, every act of violence, every single one, was initiated by you, correct?" Deborah's voice was barely audible. "Yes." Rachel turned to the judge. "No further questions." The room felt still, dense with implication. Then, to solidify the truth, Rachel called one final witness, Walter Green, the man who had witnessed nearly the entire altercation from a parked car nearby. Calm, articulate, and without bias, he explained what he saw: Deborah shouting racial insults, slapping David, then vandalizing his car. "He didn't retaliate," Walter said firmly. "He defended himself, and even then, he barely touched her." That statement landed like a gavel. The judge called for a short recess before closing arguments. David stood, stretching slightly, feeling the tremor in his own muscles. His mouth was dry, but his spirit was intact. He had feared the courtroom, the tension, the character assassinations, the distorted narratives. But now, with the truth laid bare and Deborah's own words betraying her, he felt grounded. When court reconvened, both sides made their final appeals. Deborah's lawyer asked for compassion, painted her as a mother, a citizen who had made a mistake. But Rachel Monroe closed with a truth that resonated like gospel. Accountability is not cruelty, and when someone weaponizes their privilege to inflict pain and avoid consequence, the law must intervene. Today is about more than just a slap. It's about what we allow and what we won't anymore. As the jury filed out to deliberate, David sat in stillness, staring down at his hands. He had done all he could. Now it was up to the justice system to answer. The courtroom was silent when the jury returned. Every step they took sounded amplified, echoing in David Carter's ears like drumbeats marking the seconds before fate spoke. He sat straight, hands clasped tightly in his lap, his breath slow but shallow. Across the room, Deborah Whitmore stared ahead, her face a mask of forced serenity, though a slight twitch in her jaw betrayed the nerves she tried to hide. The judge turned to the jury. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with reading glasses and a neutral expression, stood with a single sheet of paper in hand. "Yes, Your Honor." David's pulse throbbed in his ears. His palms were damp. This was it, the culmination of humiliation, restraint, and resolve. "In the case of the state versus Deborah Whitmore," the foreperson began, "we, the jury, find the defendant guilty of assault and property damage." The words hit like a wave. David let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. Deborah didn't react at first. She sat perfectly still, lips pressed into a line, her eyes locked on the desk before her. Then, like something cracked inside, her composure unraveled. Her hands trembled. Her eyes darted to her attorney, who placed a calming hand on her arm. But it was too late. The sentence had landed. The weight of her own actions had finally, publicly, caught up with her. Judge Simmons nodded. Sentencing will be scheduled at a later date. The defendant is to remain in custody until then due to the violent nature of her conduct. That statement sent Deborah into a quiet panic. "What?" she blurted, her voice sharp. "You can't do this. I didn't. This isn't justice. This is bias." The judge didn't flinch. "Ms. Whitmore, you will remain silent or be removed from the courtroom." Deborah's attorney whispered something to her, but her eyes had already found David's. They narrowed, filled with a mix of disbelief, hatred, and wounded pride. She mouthed something. He couldn't tell what, but the venom behind it was unmistakable. David didn't return the glare. He simply looked past her, focusing on nothing in particular. Around him, people were moving, packing up, murmuring softly. But he stayed in his seat for a moment longer, trying to make sense of what he was feeling. Relief, yes, but not joy. Validation, but not victory. It felt like the end of a long storm, but the air wasn't clear. Something lingered, something heavier than guilt, thicker than resentment. As he finally stood and moved toward the exit, Rachel Monroe joined him. Her tone was steady, but gentler than usual. "You did everything right, David," she said. "This was never about punishment. It was about truth." He nodded slowly. "I know, and I'm grateful, but I'm tired." Rachel offered a sympathetic smile. "That's the part no one talks about," she said. "How exhausting it is to just exist and defend your dignity at the same time." David gave a small, weary chuckle. "Exactly." Outside the courthouse, the air was crisp, the sky streaked with early evening light. He paused at the top of the steps, looking out at the parking lot, at the cars coming and going. So normal, so mundane. Yet everything had changed. Deborah's threats still echoed faintly in his mind. "You're done. You'll see." But for once, she was the one who would be held accountable. That mattered, even if it didn't erase the emotional scars she left behind. As he walked slowly toward his own car, now fully repaired, he passed a few people who had been watching the trial. A man nodded at him respectfully. A woman offered a quiet "good job" under her breath. Small gestures, but they grounded him. Not everyone had looked the other way. As he opened the car door and sat down behind the wheel, he caught his reflection in the rearview mirror. Tired eyes. Shoulders still slightly tense, but he also saw something steadier in his gaze, something earned. The verdict hadn't healed the wound, but it had acknowledged it. And that in a world where people like Deborah often walked away without consequence was no small thing. He sat in silence for a few more moments, the hum of the city around him, the weight of months slowly beginning to lift. He thought about every moment in that courtroom, every lie Deborah had tried to spin, every truth he had to fight to make heard. It shouldn't have taken this much effort for people to believe him. It shouldn't have taken a full trial to prove he was the one who had been wronged. But it had, and now that it was over, he could finally begin to let go. As he started the engine, the soft rumble of the car felt grounding. The justice system had worked, for once. But the deeper battle, the one within and around him, would take longer to quiet. Still, he had stood up, he had spoken, and he had been heard. That would have to be enough, for now. David Carter drove home with the windows cracked open, letting the cool breeze rush in as if it might wash away the weight that still pressed against his chest. The verdict was in. Deborah Whitmore had been found guilty. Justice had spoken. And yet, as he pulled into his driveway and turned off the ignition, he didn't feel triumphant. He felt hollow, exhausted, not from the trial itself, but from everything it represented. The burden of constantly proving he deserved basic respect, the mental gymnastics of staying calm under pressure, the constant calculations of how to respond without being labeled aggressive. He sat there for a moment in the stillness of the car, staring at the house he had worked so hard to afford, the quiet street where he tried to live peacefully, and wondered why peace had always felt like something he had to fight for. Inside, the house was quiet. He dropped his keys in the bowl by the door and sat on the edge of the couch, not bothering to take off his shoes. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. The images came rushing back. Deborah's slap, the sting of humiliation in public, the scratches on his car, her SUV slamming into his bumper, the way she had screamed at him like he was nothing. And then, the courtroom, the lies she spun, the calm with which she tried to rewrite the truth. He had fought through every moment of that trial with dignity, restraint, and a trembling kind of courage. And yet, despite the guilty verdict, he couldn't shake the bitterness that clung to the edges of the outcome. Deborah would face consequences, yes. But how many more Deborahs were out there, unchecked, unchallenged, still weaponizing their entitlement against people like him? It wasn't just about her. It was about the system that allowed her to believe she would get away with it. The system that had too many times before proven her right. As he sat there, a notification buzzed on his phone. A message from Rachel Monroe. "The sentencing is scheduled. I'll keep you updated. You did the right thing. Proud to stand with you." David stared at the words for a moment. Then he typed back, "Thank you. I'm just glad someone finally listened." And he meant it. For all the noise, all the cruelty, all the gaslighting and manipulation, someone had finally heard him. Not just as a defendant, not as a stereotype, but as a man telling the truth. That alone was rare. As the days passed, the memory of the trial remained vivid, but David began to reclaim parts of himself that had been chipped away. He went back to work. He took longer walks in the evening. He laughed again, slowly at first, cautiously, like testing the surface of a frozen lake. One weekend, as he was washing his car, the same one Deborah had keyed and rammed, an older neighbor walked by and paused. "Saw what happened on the news," the man said. "I'm glad you stood your ground." David nodded. "Didn't feel like I had much choice." The man hesitated, then added, "Sometimes doing the right thing doesn't feel good, but it still matters." That sentence stayed with David. It echoed in quiet moments, while brushing his teeth, reading the news, walking past the courthouse on his way downtown. It reminded him that justice wasn't a feeling. It was a choice, a hard one, a costly one, but a necessary one. Weeks later, on the day of Deborah's sentencing, David didn't attend in person. He didn't need to see her again. He didn't need to hear her final pleas or watch her play the victim one last time. He had already faced her, and he had walked away with his integrity intact. Instead, he sat on his back porch, sipping coffee, watching the wind rustle through the trees. A calm had settled over him, not peace exactly, but a kind of clarity. He hadn't asked for this fight, but when it came to him, he stood tall, and maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of something better. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, David looked up at the sky, a deep blue streaked with gold, and let himself exhale fully, for the first time in what felt like forever. He wasn't naive. He knew that racism didn't disappear with a guilty verdict. He knew that there would be more battles, more people who looked at him and saw threat instead of man. But he also knew something else. When the system tried to silence him, he spoke. When he was pushed, he didn't crumble. And when the world told him to be afraid, he answered with truth. That night, as he locked up his home and turned off the lights, David Carter wasn't just a man who had survived injustice. He was a man who had faced it, named it, and refused to bow. And in a world still full of Deborah Whitmores, that act of defiance, that quiet, unshakable dignity, was its own kind of victory.